in the third module, we are focused on experiments, in particular, all the details of an experiment. In Chapter 11, we're going to focus on threats to internal validity. Now remember, in a causal claim, like an experiment, we are most interested in internal validity. If we have a change in our dependent variable, we want to know that that change was caused by the manipulation of our independent variable, that we don't have an alternate explanation for our findings. We're also going to talk a little bit about what happens when you don't get differences in your dependent variable across the groups or levels of your independent variable. So threats to internal validity. Now remember, internal validity is our ability to know that differences in our dependent variable are due to the manipulation and differences in our independent variable. It differs from external validity, and external validity, that ability to generalize our findings across different settings, different environments, that is more important, and by that I mean external validity, more important in association and frequency claims. In this chapter, we're going to focus on 6 ways in which internal validity might be threatened, particularly when we don't have a comparison group or a control group. We're also going to talk about 3 threats that can occur in any experiment. So first of all, just know that going back, way back to Module 1, the most important part of research is our ability to have a control or comparison group. In other words, we're not just based on somebody's anecdotes or experiences. We're talking about the ability to compare across groups that experience different things. And so our really bad experiment is essentially when we take one group of individuals, we give them a pretest, we do something to them like a treatment, and then we do a post-test. With no comparison group to compare, our problem is that this post-test measure, if it in fact differs from our pre-test measure, might be due to a number of reasons. And those are our threats to internal validity. So let's talk about them one at a time. So I'm going to go through what are called maturation threats, history, regression to the mean, attrition, testing, and instrumentation threats. So these are the 6 threats that can be overcome by having a comparison or control group. Maturation threats to internal validity. If I just have a therapy group and I do a pre-test and a post-test of their depression score prior to that therapy, there's a chance that the therapy group got better or decreased their depression score simply because that's something that would have happened over time. That could be true for as children mature and get older, they're going to learn and perform cognitively better just because they got older. And so this therapy group's depression score might have just decreased because over time, on average, people's depression scores got better, not because of the therapy. And the way that we use a comparison group, like our no therapy group here in green, is to say, yes, if I just take a pre-test and a post-test, in general, scores do go down over time, but I can see that the therapy group enhanced the decrease in depression score observed. So once again, that comparison group becomes really important for being able to overcome an argument that someone could make that, well, if I just had the therapy group, those depression scores could have gotten better for a whole host of reasons. Another reason that we want a comparison group is something called a history threat. Now, a history threat means that something happened to your group, and that also influenced your scores, but it was something independent of your independent variable. So in this example, we have a Go Green campaign and no campaign, which is great because we have our comparison group. And we see that kilowatt hour of energy used from September to November goes down. Well, history threat, right? Why would, if we just had our Go Green campaign in October, why would we not be able to say that a decrease in kilowatt hours in September, that we decreased our kilowatt hours from September to November because of the Go Green campaign? Well, because the other thing that happens, of course, is we decrease things like our air conditioning use. We decrease high-intensity electrical use. So we need that no campaign to actually show that, in fact, that's what happens, right? Our Go Green campaign had no effect on this left side. Why? Because the no campaign had no effect either. The decrease in kilowatt hours used looks to be exclusively because we shifted months and therefore demand for kilowatt decreased as well. Over here in the lower right, we actually have evidence. Our no campaigns in orange, our Go Green campaigns in green. Once again, by having that comparison group, we can say there's a bigger difference due to our Go Green campaign. What's another potential threat to internal validity? Once again, a reason why our dependent measure might have changed independent of our independent variable. In other words, it's something else that we could use to explain changes in our dependent variable. Well, in part, what happens in a regression threat is if someone scored high on a measure, on average, their score will go down the next time they're assessed. It will regress toward the mean. Just as if someone scored very low, on average, next time they get tested, their score is going to increase. What we have here in the top graph is, once again, our therapy group. Well, if someone has a very high depressed score in the pre-therapy, a possible explanation for a decrease in the post-therapy is simply that by measuring depression scores again in a group that had high depression scores to begin with, it's likely that the scores will go down. And in fact, by adding that no therapy comparison group in green, we can see that there is a slight decrease in the depression scores. But once again, our therapy group has a better decrease or a more substantial decrease. Another reason that comparison group is so important. But it's also really important that your no therapy group and your therapy group start from those high points at the same high point. In other words, here we have an example where our no therapy group does flatline right here, and our therapy group is going down. But here's our problem. Because the therapy group starts higher than the no therapy group, the therapy group could still be reducing or regressing toward the mean. In other words, we really want to make sure, if possible, that our comparison group is equal to our treatment group before we institute the independent variable. Now, in this case, on the bottom, our therapy group went past the mean. It goes down past the mean of the no therapy group that stayed stable. Now, this suggests that regression alone can't have contributed to our scores, and that therapy must have also had some influence. But our strongest case that it's therapy is made up by the top graph, because our therapy group and our comparison group are starting from the same place. So far, we've got maturation, we've got history, and we've got regression to the mean. 3 of the 6 possible threats to internal validity if we don't include a control or comparison group. What about attrition threat? An attrition threat merely is saying that you've got individuals or subjects who are leaving your study. And as a result, we have differences in our post-test because we have fewer people, and those fewer people represent higher scores on the pre-test. So in other words, attrition of individuals from pre to post may be driving in part changes in the post-dependent variable. So once again, it's not our therapy, it's the fact that the two people who had the highest scores at the pre-test left our study and therefore weren't assessed at the post-test. Now, that doesn't matter quite so much if those people who are attritioning out or leaving your study are perhaps in the midpoint. But the best way to prevent an attrition threat to internal validity is to, if a participant leaves your study, to remove them from the pre-test measures as well. Okay. Testing is another threat to internal validity. Once again, if we had just a pre and post test with no comparison group. So a testing threat means that as I encounter a test, I get better on that test in the future. I change my understanding of the test or my anxiety level, but testing itself in some way affects me. In fact, that's what we do when we take our quizzes as part of our class. The quizzes in our class are designed to maximize the testing effect, in that by testing on a pre-test like a quiz, we hopefully will improve our exam scores the second test around. Now, a testing effect essentially is a type of order effect. And once again, we don't know if the improvement in scores from pre-test to post-test are because the participants just getting smarter about the test. If I can add a comparison group over here on the right, I can see that in fact my comparison group is getting better from pre to post, once again likely because of that testing effect. But by having that comparison group, I can see that my treatment group is doing even better at the post-test, suggesting that once again, having that comparison group is incredibly important to be able to suggest or indicate or conclude that our independent variable is having an effect on our dependent variable. The last of the 6 threats to internal validity that can happen when you don't have a comparison group and you're only doing a pre and a post test with one group in particular is something called an instrumentation threat. An instrumentation threat occurs when your measuring device changes over time. Remember, since you've got 2 measurements, a pre and a post measurement, if something happens in between those 2 and it's because of your instrumentation, it's not because of your independent variable. Do remember that things like observers that are scoring behavior are considered instrumentation. That's how you're scoring your dependent variable. The difference between testing threats and instrumentation threats is that a testing threat occurs because of a change in the participant. An instrumentation threat occurs because of a change in the measuring instrument from time 1 to time 2. Now, we've got 6 potential changes or threats that we've talked about already, but I want you to be aware we can combine those threats with something called selection. Now, if you recall selection, that is when you allow individuals to self-select into your different groups or levels or conditions of your independent variable. So what happens in a selection history threat, essentially, is that an outside event or factor systematically changes one group of your participants versus the other. So if we had, say, a treatment versus a comparison group, and our treatment group were all getting therapy, and that therapy group also happened to get outside more because they had to walk to their therapy session. And in fact, they selected into that therapy because they could, in fact, walk to that therapy session. Well, now we've got a selection history threat because the history now is that one group is systematically going outside, experiencing something that the other participants aren't experiencing. The same thing here, true of a selection attrition threat. What happens if one of your groups has more people leaving it than the other group? And in fact, the dependent variable is changing in that group where everyone's leaving, because the people who are really, really depressed, for example, that had been assigned to the comparison group, they leave your experiment because they want therapy. So they're going to go get therapy on their own because they weren't randomly assigned to that group. Well, that means that your comparison group's going to go down in depression just because some people are leaving. So we want to beware of instances in which only one group or condition in your experiment is being affected by a threat. In addition to those 6 main threats to internal validity, when we don't have a comparison group, and the fact that those threats can interact or combine, I want to talk briefly about 3 potential threats to internal validity that can happen in any experiment. Something called observer bias, demand characteristics, and placebo effects. So an observer bias is when the researcher's expectations influence how they interpret the results. And so an observer bias, once again, can affect any experiment. And as a result, we will often set up things like double-blind studies or mass studies so that the experimenters or researchers that are interacting with the participants don't know which group the participants are in. The same is true for demand characteristics. That's when your participants figure out what the research is about and change their behavior because they think that's the behavior you want. Once again, by having a double-blind study, or in this case, a blind study where participants don't know what group they're in, but observers do, in that case, demand characteristics hopefully will not influence participant behavior. So once again, a double-blind study refers to the fact that both participants and researchers are blind to which group the participant's in. A mass study is sometimes called a blind study, not a double-blind study. And in that case, a mass study occurs when the participants don't know what group they're in. The other thing we want to be cautious of are placebo effects. And a placebo effect is simply by being part of an experiment and thinking that you might be getting help in the form of perhaps a drug, individuals may change their behavior or emotional state. And it's not because of the treatment itself. It's because they think they're getting treatment. A placebo effect actually has been shown to be pretty consistent in antidepressant drugs. So about 30% of the decrease in depression scores that occur when individuals are put on antidepressants occur because of this placebo effect. And in fact, there's also something called a nocebo, where if I tell you a drug is going to create side effects, there's a proportion of individuals who start to experience those side effects. And so placebo effects are about changing the participant simply because there's an expectation of change by the participant. So in this case over here, we've got on the left side graph, we've got a pre-test rating, a post-test rating. I have a true therapy and a placebo therapy. And as you can see, the placebo therapy improves or decreases the symptoms not to the same extent that the true therapy does. But it's much clearer when we simply have a no therapy group, where we can see how placebo itself can help improve that post-test rating, but not improve it as much as true therapy. And that, in effect, is why you often have both a placebo and even sometimes a no placebo group. So, as a reminder, what kinds of additional threats can we have? And with so many threats, are experiments still useful? And what I'm going to do now is stop this video and move forward with another video for part 2.